I was sitting alone in my apartment the morning I turned 68 when the message finally arrived. Not on my birthday, not the day after, but 3 days later. A short text from my son, Daniel. He wished me a happy birthday, as if the day were a casual afterthought, and then told me that I should have reminded him. Those words hit me like ice water poured straight into my chest. After all the years I had spent remembering every detail of his life, from the cake I baked on his 5th birthday to the tuition bills I quietly covered when he was grown, he thought it was my job to remind him of the day I brought him into this world. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands trembling, my heart trying to make sense of it. A part of me wanted to excuse him, to say he was busy with work or distracted with his family. But something inside me snapped that morning. A quiet strength I hadn't felt in years rose up in me. By that same afternoon, I called the lawyer who managed the family trust. I told him to stop the automatic transfers that had been flowing into Daniel's household for years. By midnight, my phone lit up with call after call, 20, 30, then nearly 50 times. His voice on the voicemails grew more frantic with each hour, but not once did he say he missed me or that he loved me. All he said was that he needed the money. Daniel had grown used to a life where his bills disappeared before they became problems. The mortgage on that big suburban house, the cars in the driveway, the credit cards his wife, Melissa. Filled with shopping trips, all of it had been smoothed over by my late husband's careful planning and my willingness to keep giving. Their 2 children, sweet as they were, went to private schools I paid for. They had vacations and tutors, and every comfort I never dreamed of having when I was young. And there I was, in my quiet apartment, realizing that the only thing they saw when they looked at me was a purse with no bottom. The betrayal of that simple text was sharper than anything I'd felt before. It wasn't just that my birthday had been forgotten. It was the way Daniel placed the blame on me, as if even my own celebration should be my responsibility to manage for his convenience. That was the moment I stopped being the doormat. I pressed my phone face down on the table, took a long breath, and felt something cold but steady settle in my chest. For decades, I had given and given, believing that love meant sacrifice. But now, staring at that screen and hearing the endless buzz of unanswered calls, I realized this was not a single mistake. This was the final straw in a long pattern of taking. And if I wanted to understand how I got to this breaking point, I had to look back at all the years of silent giving that led me here. After Robert passed away, the house felt impossibly quiet. I had spent 43 years with him, and when the silence settled in after his funeral, I didn't quite know how to fill it. What I did know was that Daniel and Melissa needed me, or at least they said they did. So I poured myself into helping them, believing that was what family was for. In those first 5 years, I became the invisible backbone of their lives. When Daniel and Melissa wanted a sprawling home in the suburbs, I wrote a check for the down payment. When tuition bills arrived from the private school they chose for the children, I made sure they were paid on time. When Melissa's shopping habits turned into maxed-out credit cards, I quietly covered the balances so no one would know. Month after month, I watched money leave my accounts, funding their dream while I stayed in the same old apartment Robert and I had shared for 3 decades. My days were simple, lived between these 4 walls and punctuated by weekly drives out to their house for Sunday dinners. I would sit at their polished table, listening as they talked about renovations or vacations. Often, Melissa was scrolling through her phone, barely glancing in my direction. The children, polite but distant, seemed to view me more as an obligation than a grandmother. I told myself that this was just how modern families were. I convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, that if I gave enough, they would eventually see me as more than just the woman who paid their bills. That belief carried me right into my 68th birthday. I went to the grocery store the day before, determined to bake Daniel's favorite cake, the same chocolate cake I had made since he was a little boy. My hands ached from arthritis as I stirred the batter. But I pushed through, telling myself he would smile when he saw it. That morning, I sent him a message letting him know the cake was ready whenever he wanted to stop by. Then I waited. All day long, I listened for his car, checked my phone, peeked through the curtains each time headlights swept across the street. Morning faded into afternoon, and afternoon into evening. Still no Daniel. Still no call. The cake sat there on the counter, untouched, mocking my hope. The next day was the same, and the day after that. By the fourth morning, the cake was stale, and my heart felt the same. I scraped it into the garbage disposal, fighting back tears as the blade swallowed the crumbs of a tradition that no longer mattered. In that moment, I realized something sharp and painful. It wasn't just that Daniel had forgotten. It was that my years of giving, my years of loyalty and sacrifice, had meant nothing to him. That cake was the symbol of every unacknowledged gift, every ignored gesture of love. And throwing it away was the first step toward throwing away the illusion that kept me chained to their needs. I didn't know it yet, but the ache of that birthday would be the push I needed to finally take control of my life. When I finally sat down and looked at the numbers, the truth was impossible to ignore. In the 5 years since Robert passed, I had given Daniel and Melissa nearly $85,000 in direct payments. That didn't even include the countless checks written for holidays, graduations, birthdays, or the $2,000 I quietly handed over for the down payment on their dream house. Nearly $1 million had flowed out of my accounts, and in return, what did I have? A son who forgot my birthday, and a daughter-in-law who could barely look up from her phone long enough to acknowledge me. It wasn't just about money, it was about the one-sidedness of it all. I had shown up for them through every crisis, every shortfall, every whim. And yet in 5 long years, Daniel had called me to ask about my health only a handful of times. But when he needed money, the phone never stopped ringing. The scale of it weighed on me, decades of sacrifice stacked up against the hollow absence of gratitude. Something in me shifted after the birthday cake incident. The part of me that had always made excuses, that had always softened the blow, finally hardened. I picked up the phone, not to call Daniel, but to call James, the family lawyer who had been with us for years. My voice didn't shake when I told him I wanted the automatic transfers stopped. Not delayed, not reduced, stopped. That same afternoon, the lifeline that had been propping up their entire lifestyle was cut off. At first, there was silence, but within a few days, the storm began. My phone lit up with Daniel's name again and again. Voicemails piled up, one after another. I could hear his voice shift from confusion to irritation, then from irritation to panic. Melissa's number appeared too, her tone sharp and desperate. And yet, through all of it, the message was the same. They weren't worried about me. They weren't even curious about why I had gone quiet. They were terrified about money, about bills, about their mortgage. And there I was, sitting in my armchair with a cup of tea, finally feeling something I hadn't felt in years' power. For the first time since Robert's death, I wasn't scrambling to please or stretching myself to keep the peace. I wasn't their safety net anymore. Each frantic call they made only deepened my calm. Like waves crashing against a cliff that had stood for centuries. I knew then that this was just the beginning. Their desperation wouldn't stop at phone calls. Sooner or later, they would show up at my door, demanding answers. And when they did, I would be ready. It was late afternoon when I heard the pounding on my door. Not a gentle knock. Not the sound of someone stopping by for a visit, but urgent, sharp, and impatient. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Daniel's voice carried through the wood, his tone rising. Melissa's sharper edge layered over his. They hadn't come to see how I was. They had come for answers. I opened the door slowly, keeping my posture steady, almost regal. There they were, Melissa's face flushed, Daniel's brow damp with sweat. They brushed past me before I could even gesture them inside. Their energy filling my small apartment with a storm I refused to let shake me. I moved with deliberate calm, setting the kettle on for coffee, letting the minutes stretch as they demanded explanations. Inside, I felt the tension coil tight, but I wouldn't let it show. I stirred sugar into my cup, listening to their words tumble over each other, fear about bills, panic about the mortgage, complaints about canceled credit cards. Not once did I hear a question about me. Not once did I hear the word mom spoken with care. Just frantic talk about money, as if I were a malfunctioning machine that had suddenly stopped dispensing cash. When I finally spoke, my voice was low and even. I told them I had grown tired of being treated like a bank, that my love had been measured only in dollars, my presence valued only when it came with a check attached. For a moment, silence cut through the air, heavy and undeniable. Melissa's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with indignation. Daniel's shoulders slumped, and for once he looked like a boy again, pleading, desperate, not for me, but for the money. That was when I laid it out the proposition. 30 days. If they wanted my support, they had to prove they saw me as more than an account number. 30 days of genuine care, of showing up, of treating me like a mother and a person, not a bottomless purse. At the end of that time, I would decide if they had earned back my trust. Melissa bristled, her lips pressing into a thin line. I could almost hear her thoughts calculating, already scheming about what this performance would require. Daniel nodded too quickly, agreeing before the weight of my words could even sink in. I watched them both, and I knew this was not an epiphany for them. This was survival. Still, I felt the balance shift. For the first time in years, I wasn't begging for scraps of affection. I was setting the terms. They might have agreed reluctantly, but the power was mine now, as they left my apartment, promising to do better. I stood at the window, watching their car disappear down the street, and deep inside, I already suspected the next 30 days would not be filled with love. They would be filled with rehearsed gestures, empty words, and attempts to manipulate. But I was ready for it. This was my test for them and for myself. The change was almost comical in its timing. One day, my phone was silent except for their desperate voicemails about bills. The next, it was buzzing with cheerful messages, updates about the kids, and invitations for lunch. Daniel and Melissa had flipped a switch, and suddenly I was supposed to believe I was the center of their world. Melissa showed up at my door with flowers one morning, her smile so wide it looked rehearsed. The bouquet was expensive, roses in perfect bloom, but she set them down like a trophy rather than a gift. Later that week, Daniel brought the children by with a box of cookies from a bakery downtown. He laughed too loudly as he nudged them to hug me, his eyes darting to mine to see if I was impressed. The gestures were sweet on the surface, but I felt the calculation beneath each one. For a moment, I wanted to let myself believe. I wanted to think maybe the trial I had set had opened their eyes, that they had finally realized how much I longed for real connection. But then I would notice Melissa scrolling through her phone the second she thought I wasn't looking, or Daniel's forced chuckle when the kids asked questions about me that he clearly hadn't prepared them for. The cracks in their performance showed through, and those cracks hurt worse than silence. I caught myself sitting at the kitchen table, running my hands over the roses as they began to wilt. I thought about the countless times I had baked cakes, sewn costumes, and paid bills, gestures of love that came from a place of sincerity, not strategy. Now I was on the receiving end of gestures that looked right but felt hollow. It was a strange ache to crave their affection while knowing it wasn't real. The kids tried in their own way. They told me stories from school, their little voices unpolished and honest. But even then, I could feel Daniel's hand guiding the conversation, steering it back toward how close we all were now. The sweetness was tainted by the weight of expectation, and I couldn't shake the irony. Here they were, showering me with affection only because their survival depended on it. Each night, I lay in bed replaying the day's events, torn between wanting to accept the gestures and needing to see them for what they were. The loneliness inside me whispered that some love, even false love, was better than none. But my instincts pushed back harder, reminding me that I had lived too long giving without receiving. By the end of that second week, I knew the truth. Their sudden affection was nothing more than performance. If I wanted to uncover their real intentions, I couldn't just wait for cracks to show. I would have to create the conditions that exposed them. And so, quietly, I began planning a test that neither Daniel nor Melissa would see coming. I realized that instinct alone wasn't enough anymore. My gut had been whispering to me for weeks. But if I was going to protect myself, I needed proof. Not just vague suspicions, not just the ache in my chest every time Daniel or Melissa turned on their counterfeit smiles. I needed facts, hard evidence, something no one could deny or twist. So I began quietly, methodically. The first step was my own peace of mind. I scheduled a full mental competency evaluation with one of the most respected doctors in Manhattan. Sitting in that office, answering questions, taking tests, I felt a strange mix of indignation and relief. It angered me that I even had to prove my sanity to safeguard my life. But when I walked away with a clean bill of health, I knew I had just built my strongest shield. The next call was to my lawyer. I asked him to revisit the trust, to tighten the bolts and close every loophole. He hesitated at first, asking what had prompted this sudden urgency, but I didn't need to explain. The weight of years of neglect and the sharp sting of that forgotten birthday were reason enough. But the most decisive step came when I contacted a private investigator. I needed eyes where mine couldn't reach, ears that could hear the whispers behind my back. Days stretched long while I waited for her report, each phone call from Daniel dripping with syrupy concern. Each visit from Melissa lined with false sweetness. On the surface, they were attentive children. Beneath it, I felt the ground shifting. When the investigator finally returned with her findings, I sat at my kitchen table and read every word as if my life depended on it. And in many ways, it did. Massive credit card debts, a second mortgage, lavish shopping sprees Melissa had disguised as household expenses, and then the darker revelation, a separate account where my money was funneled, shuffled, and hidden. But it was the documents that broke something deep inside me. Legal paperwork, drafted years ago, setting the foundation for guardianship over my assets. They had been planning this from the beginning. While I thought I was saving them, supporting them, giving them a better life, they were quietly building a case to paint me as incapable, unstable, unfit to handle my own affairs. And as they smiled across my dining table, bringing me flowers and cookies, they were whispering to others that I was slipping, that I couldn't be trusted, that I needed protection. The rage that came wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was cold, precise, and sharper than it had ever been. They thought they were clever, but they had underestimated me. I wasn't just a mother with a soft heart anymore. I was a widow who had been through grief, betrayal, and loneliness, and I had survived all of it. By the time I folded the report and set it aside, my course was clear. This game they had started, I was going to finish, not with pleading or compromise, but with evidence, strategy, and a resolve they couldn't bend. The next move would be mine, and I would make it at a dinner table they thought they controlled. They had no idea that their performance was about to collapse under the weight of the truth. The table was set as if nothing were wrong. China plates, polished silverware, a vase of fresh lilies in the center. I poured the wine slowly, steadying my hand, as if I were simply welcoming my family for a warm dinner. But beneath that calm exterior, my heart beat like a drum. Tonight wasn't about food or small talk. Tonight was about truth. Daniel and Melissa arrived dressed impeccably, smiling too wide, their words dripping with the same practiced sweetness they had been showering me with for weeks. They complimented my cooking, complimented the flowers, even complimented the modest apartment they once considered beneath them. I let them settle in. I let them feel comfortable. And then, once we had all taken our first bites, I began. I reminded myself to breathe slowly as I unfolded the first sheet of paper copies from my lawyer. I explained that the automatic transfers had been stopped permanently, that the trust would be revised. Daniel's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Melissa's lips tightened, though she tried to force another smile. Then I placed the next piece of evidence on the table, the investigator's report. Page after page showed their hidden debts, the gambling transactions, the luxury vacations charged while I quietly counted pennies at the grocery store. My voice stayed calm, even gentle, but each word was deliberate, slicing through the air like a blade. Daniel stammered excuses, claims about bad luck, about temporary setbacks. Melissa, on the other hand, snapped. Her sweetness melted into fury, her voice sharp and cold. She accused me of being paranoid, ungrateful even, as though my years of sacrifice had been nothing more than a duty owed. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I laid out the final piece, the whispers they had spread about my so-called mental decline, the rumors to neighbors, the quiet inquiries about guardianship. I saw the blood drain from Daniel's face. Melissa crossed her arms, her eyes darting anywhere but mine. In that moment, something shifted inside me. For years I had been the widow who gave, the mother who bent, the grandmother who swallowed her hurt in silence. But not tonight. Tonight I was steel. I told them, with a calmness that surprised even me, that I would live the years I had left on my own terms. No more being treated like an ATM, No more manipulation disguised as affection. Daniel's shoulders sagged with shame, though he couldn't meet my eyes. Melissa hissed under her breath, already calculating her next move. But I didn't need their words anymore. I had seen the truth. The dinner ended not with dessert, but with silence. They gathered their things, their chairs scraping against the floor. I watched them leave, the door clicking shut behind them, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I was no longer afraid of being alone. I was free. And as I cleared the plates, stacking them neatly in the sink, I knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of living life on my own terms. When the door closed behind Daniel and Melissa, I sat in the quiet of my apartment. The silence felt heavy at first, but then it softened into something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. For the first time in so long, I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come or clinging to a hope that someone else would value me the way I deserved. I simply sat with myself, and that was enough. Looking back, I can see the years of sacrifice, every check written, every bill paid, every lonely birthday waiting by the window. I had confused giving with love, believing that if I gave enough, maybe they would see me, respect me, cherish me. But love without respect is not love at all. It's control, it's manipulation, and it eats away at your spirit piece by piece. That night, as I cleared the table, I realized I had chosen something far more powerful than their approval. I had chosen myself. Boundaries are not walls to shut people out. They are doors that protect the dignity of the life we build. And sometimes, even with family, those doors need to be closed. To anyone listening who feels trapped in a cycle of giving without gratitude, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not selfish for wanting respect. You are not wrong for saying no. You are worthy of peace, and you have the right to draw the line, even if it's with the people you love most. This was my story, but maybe it speaks to yours. If it does, I invite you to share your thoughts, your own lessons, your own strength. And if my journey touched you in any way, I'd be grateful if you liked, shared, and commented. Because the more we speak about these truths, the less alone we all feel.